Hello and welcome to this webinar from iCASP on Where Next for Yorkshire Soils. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this session today and hope that you're going to find it really interesting and useful. We're in a very exciting position in terms of where we are with soils, and I think the first thing to think about is Yorkshire soils. What are they like, and what are the particular things that we need to be aware of for Yorkshire soils now and on into the future? When you look at the left-hand side of this slide at the distribution of organic matter in soils across the UK, the region within the blue box approximately covers the region of Yorkshire and Humberside. And what you can see within that region is a huge diversity of organic matter storage, from values that are amongst the highest in the UK right down to values that are amongst the lowest. And this is reflected also in the diversity of the quality of the land from a perspective of agricultural land classification, so its potential utility for growing crops and producing products from the land. If you look at the Natural England map of the 5 grades of agricultural land classification, from the very highest grade, grade 1, right through to the very lowest grade, grade 5, you can see that Yorkshire Humberside region actually encompasses soils that actually embrace the full range of diversity of values in terms of agricultural production. And the other thing to draw attention to here is actually there's almost like an inverse relationship between things like carbon storage in the uplands, and these regions being a very low agricultural value, but actually in terms of their cultural value and in terms of their importance for climate change mitigation, for example, in terms of carbon storage, these are hugely important regions. But the other thing to say here is that the bright blue regions in the lowlands actually represent peaty soils, and you can see the sort of correspondence. These are lowland peatlands. So it also doesn't follow automatically that soils that have got a high organic matter content are automatically of low value from the point of view of agricultural production. Indeed, the highest value agricultural soils are actually lowland peats, although they bring with them a series of problems in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and long-term sustainability. So I think that the take-home messages from this stage in thinking about Yorkshire soils is within the Yorkshire region, there's a huge diversity. There's a huge diversity of land uses, huge diversity of soil types, and big range of values in terms of agricultural production values, but also values in terms of ecological and ecosystem service values. Many of these upland areas are really, really important for water filtration and water storage, and the lowland regions actually are really important interfaces where, and sometimes quite vulnerable to issues of water shedding from the uplands into the lowlands, potentially causing things like flooding and so on, which we'll come on to shortly. So Yorkshire soils, they're important, they're diverse, and they represent the full range, as it were, of types of soils really within the UK, or certainly a very large proportion of the range of soil types that we find in the UK. And in terms of their importance nationally, they are really important. You know, Yorkshire makes a major contribution to UK food production and food security. In terms of England, 15% of the crops that are grown in England and 13% of the livestock produced in England come out of Yorkshire, and yet Yorkshire is only 12% of the area of England. So Yorkshire is punching harder relative to its area than other regions of England in terms of its agricultural production and its contribution to food security at a national scale. It's also really important in terms of water storage and flood risk management. And of course, there are major reservoirs and water storage facilities built into the landscapes in Yorkshire, supporting the water requirements both of industry, of households, and of agriculture as well. But also we are within a region which has historically, and particularly in recent years, suffered quite severely from major impacts of flooding in the lowlands as a result of heavy rainfall, and particularly as a result of some of these more extreme rainfall events that we've been seeing in recent years. There are also major issues in terms of water quality, nutrients and pesticide flows, water contamination. And although water quality in the region as a whole has improved enormously in recent decades, there remain issues about nutrient transfers and pesticide flows and contaminants coming particularly out of agriculture, and also out of nutrient flows that are coming out of urban areas as well, which aren't necessarily soil sourced. The climate change mitigation issues in terms of carbon storage, as I've already indicated, Yorkshire stores a lot of carbon within organic rich soils, and it's really important that we maintain those stocks of carbon and stores in the uplands. Some of the regions of the uplands are actually gaining more carbon at the moment, but others are actually starting to lose it or have been losing it as a result of changes in management and climate. And then the other part to the story is also the importance of the soils within the region in terms of supporting biodiversity. There are 3 national parks within the region, and these are underpinned by diverse soil landscapes and soil management systems within those landscapes, where the soils are contributing to maintaining those iconic and important landscapes for many millions of visitors each year. So when we think about where next, what are the big issues that face us thinking about Yorkshire soils? Well, as I say, we've already started to touch on some of those. I think there are major issues about climate change, the effects of floods, and particularly many of the lowland soils around some of our major rivers within the region are increasingly subjected to or at risk of flooding, often with the major implications for crop losses or impacts on the soil systems themselves. There are also potential problems with droughts, and so the capacity of soil to store water becomes really important. And also linked into the droughting issues are particularly the risks associated with fire, particularly fires in the uplands on some of these very organic rich soils, where the accumulated depths of peat that may have taken centuries or even thousands of years, millennia, to accumulate, can be burnt away in relatively short periods of time when peatlands dry out and when you get extreme fire events. And then most of the agricultural industry, and many of you, I hope today, will include farmers and advisors that are directly involved in agriculture, will be aware that there have been major policy changes in government in recent years, and the aspiration and plans now to work towards removing public subsidy linked just simply to land areas, but directing that money into public money for public goods. And that substantially changes how we evaluate the contribution of soils and their role in delivering public goods, and then the set of issues about how we manage soils to better deliver those goods into the future. And then there are also these major issues about trying to meet government targets in terms of net emissions policy goals. The notion that we will in future decades reach the point where as a country we have a net CO2 emission zero is a hugely ambitious target, and soils have to play a role in that, because one potential way we can, as it were, start to help to achieve those targets is to try to get more carbon back into the ground. And certainly we need to ensure we don't lose carbon from the ground, because that obviously is going in the opposite direction and not helping us meet those targets. And then the other part to meeting some of those targets are these very ambitious plans for tree planting, national tree planting targets. If you apportion the areas of trees, of new forests that are supposed to be planted over the coming decades across the country, we're looking at something like nearly 1,000 square kilometres of new forests to be established in the Yorkshire Humberside region. And the question is, well, where would we put all these trees? What sort of land would we put them on? And in particular, how do we best fit those trees into a landscape so that we don't, for example, cause drying out of peat soils, or on the other hand, don't take out of production land which is really important for food security and food production. So it's fitting these things into the landscape and managing soil systems in a way that's sustainable, which represents, I think, a combined set of quite major challenges. But also, in many ways, this is exciting because we're beginning to see policy directions that actually maybe give a higher priority to looking after and protecting soils and soil resources into the future. And the start of the government direction on this perhaps was best intimated, or was most clearly intimated, through the 25-year environment plan, where there was this very ambitious goal to sustainably manage all of England's soil by 2030. And one of the things that was emphasised through this report, though, on the other hand, was that we currently lack sufficient data to know just how badly our soil has been affected, and the claims that the environment plan of the government aims to correct that. Although I must say there are major issues still about the delivery of what's actually been aspired to in this plan. Although the aspirations are very laudable, the delivery still seems to be quite far off target in relation to some of these goals. And it's interesting with the Sustainable Soils Alliance, and I'm on the scientific advisory committee to this charitable organisation, which is a major lobbying group to try and promote more sustainable management of soils and their protection in the UK. They made a Freedom of Information request earlier at the end of last year, for which they got a response earlier this year, looking at how much money has the government actually been spending on soil monitoring in England compared to how much it's been spending on monitoring of, say, water quality or air quality. And the figures are really quite depressing and staggering, that, water quality is receiving about over £60 million of investment in monitoring each year. Air quality, well over 7 million, approaching 8 million. And soil quality is getting a paltry 284,000 when they're scrabbling around trying to find the evidence even for these numbers. There is no national monitoring of soil quality in the UK. There hasn't been for decades, and there hasn't been a government commitment to actually systematically maintain or monitor what's going on with England's soils. The devolved regions, interestingly, have done a better job at maintaining soil monitoring and developing processes to monitoring soil quality. And I think we need to put this into an economic perspective, that at the end of the day, this underinvestment in soil monitoring needs to be put alongside what's it actually costing the UK economy as a result of soil degradation across England and Wales. And the estimates that were drawn up by Graves et al. In 2015 suggested that something like £1.2 billion a year is being lost from the UK economy as a result of soil degradation. Much of that, nearly half of that economic loss, is due to the loss of organic matter, which degrades the functionality of the soil and its capacity to store water, its capacity to store nutrients, and also its capacity to be structurally structural integrity. And then also linked into that, and associated particularly with the way in which the soils are being managed, a lot of the problems also linked through to soil compaction. Nearly 40% of these losses are due to compaction. And of course, compaction reduces the capacity of water to flow into the soil, so it tends to flow across the surface, and then it causes erosion, causes pollution, and causes sediment movement and clogging up of rivers with sediment and so on. So and erosion itself, then, as I say, the estimates for erosion are based on guesstimates, actually, to be fair. And the authors, they say themselves, actually, we don't have any national monitoring data of high enough quality, really, to know exactly how much erosion is going on. But these are figures which are derived from a number of sort of indirect evidences. So there's a set of problems, certainly, and soil management for the future does need to be, as it were, much greater prioritised than it has in the past. And coming back to the importance of soils in Yorkshire, this applies equally in Yorkshire. But as I say, I think there's also good news. I mean, soil health is a new farming policy goal. There's recognition in the government and in DEFRA in particular that good soil management is important for public goods and services. Clean water, reducing the risks of flooding, biodiversity, carbon storage, etc. And the current consultations about the new environmental land management scheme, which will pay farmers, as it were, for public goods, highlights a series of potential targets for funding which would apply to farmers, particularly in relation to aspects of soil management and so on. So if you look at these examples here, I've put blue arrows alongside all the components that really directly relate to soil or soil management, including the nutrient management, the way in which grazing is managed to reduce compaction and soil damage, direct issues of soil management in terms of types of cultivation, how the cultivation is done, maintaining organic matter and improving that, maintaining water levels in peat soils, and then increasing use of things like minimal tillage or no tillage. And then even right down to how the field margins are managed. And you might regard these not immediately as directly soil relevant, but actually the management of the field margins is quite critical in terms of these are areas which are relatively undisturbed and often provide an important buffer where the soil quality is higher and the filtration and infiltration of the soil is improved as a result. Field cover, in terms of cover crops, arable rotations, companion cropping and so on, use of lays, and then also efficient water storage and water use, which again often can relate back through into how the soils are managed. Now, what's interesting here is actually a lot of the topics that are represented here in these potential tier 1 funding options, which as I say is still under discussion, are actually a number of things that we're going to be talking about today. And in fact, as we look at the programme, Pippa Chapman's talk following on from me is focusing very much on these public goods and soil health issues, payment for outcomes, Elizabeth Sullivan's presentation, and then also Manolis's presentation about learning from the EU about agri-environment schemes, again relates to how we manage the environment in order to improve aspects of the soil and other aspects that link through to water qualities and so on. And then Kevin Hicks's presentation on integrated nitrogen management, which again, all of these issues are sort of interrelated and come back to these goals that the DEFRA is starting to set. And then, as I say, we'll have a chance to have a wider question and answer discussion at the end of this related to all these areas. But I hope that this will prove to be a really fruitful and helpful discussion period, and also that these presentations will set the scene for some really frank and useful exchanges between us all. But anyway, that's enough for me just to introduce the session. But thank you very much for listening.